Under the dry blue sky of the desert, a lonely wind drifted through the valley, whispering through the sagebrush and rattling the splintered boards of an old wooden cabin. It had once stood proud, a place where laughter, smoke, and the smell of bread once lived. Now, it leaned to one side, its roof sunken like a tired old horse. From a distance, it looked almost forgotten. But that day, someone was coming home. A woman, barefoot with the earth's dust clinging to the hem of her russet dress, walked toward it with slow, steady steps. Her hands rested on the roundness of her belly, the child inside shifting gently as if it too could feel the pull of that place. She was Apache by blood, born to the red earth and the burning sun, yet she had spent years away among strangers who spoke of progress and profit. Her parents had once owned this small patch of land, a place that meant more to them than gold or cattle ever could. But when the droughts came and the soldiers pushed west, they were forced to leave. Now, years later, their daughter had returned carrying life within her. To reclaim what little they had left behind, the land hadn't forgotten her. Each gust of wind seemed to carry the memory of her childhood, the echo of her father's voice calling her name, the hum of her mother's songs near the fire, the bark of a dog that had guarded the doorway. Yet beneath those memories was something else, a weight that pressed against her chest, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. She paused in front of the cabin. The boards creaked in the hot air, almost alive. The roof was broken, the door half hanging, but it still stood proud in its ruin, refusing to fall. She touched the weathered frame, feeling the warmth of the sun through the wood, and whispered softly, "I'm home." Her voice carried across the empty land, swallowed by the stillness. For a moment, all she felt was peace, the kind that comes when the past and the present meet in the same place. But then, a strange unease crept in. There was something about the air around the cabin, heavy, almost listening. She looked toward the mountains on the horizon, where the wind began to stir up small spirals of dust. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried. Inside, the cabin smelled of age and dust. The floor groaned under her weight, each step stirring up tiny clouds that caught the sunlight like ghosts. The walls were bare, but she could still see faint marks where once hung a woven blanket or her father's old bow. The table in the corner was broken, yet on it rested a single clay cup, unbroken, untouched by time. She frowned. No one had lived here in years. How could it still be there? She picked up the cup and brushed the dust away. Beneath it was a folded piece of leather, cracked and faded. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, there were lines markings she recognized from her father's teachings, symbols of protection, words of warning, and at the very bottom, a handprint pressed in dried earth. Her mother's. The child inside her shifted again, a small kick against her ribs. She smiled faintly, though her eyes remained fixed on the leather piece. Something in her heart told her that this was not just an old relic. It was a message. A call from the past. She set it down carefully and looked around once more. In the corner, a faint glimmer caught her attention, light reflecting off something half buried under debris. She knelt and brushed the dirt aside, revealing a small wooden box sealed with a strip of rawhide. The lock was rusted, but intact. Her breath caught as she traced her fingers along the carvings etched into its lid, the same pattern her father used to carve into arrows. A mark of his tribe. Outside, the wind picked up. The old boards of the cabin rattled like bones, and for a moment she thought she heard footsteps, soft, almost hesitant, circling the cabin. She froze, listening. The desert was wide and empty, yet her instincts, sharpened by years of surviving alone, told her she was not alone now. She moved to the doorway and looked out. Nothing, just the vast sweep of land, golden under the sun. Still, her pulse quickened. She placed her hand protectively on her belly and whispered a quiet prayer in her native tongue. When she turned back inside, the light had shifted. Shadows stretched long across the floorboards, reaching toward the box. She hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. Then she sat beside it, using the edge of a stone to pry at the lock until it snapped. The lid creaked open slowly. Inside lay a collection of old things, dried herbs, small beaded necklace, and a folded piece of animal hide tied with sinew. She untied it and found inside a map drawn in charcoal and blood. Her heart pounded as she studied it. The markings led to the hills just beyond the desert where she and her father once hunted as a child. Near the bottom, a single word was written in her mother's hand. Remember? Her eyes filled with tears. All her life, she had carried the guilt of leaving, of surviving when her family did not. Now, it felt as if the land itself had called her back, not just to remember, but to finish what they had begun. She looked toward the horizon again, where the sun began its slow descent, turning the world to amber. The child kicked again, stronger this time, and she smiled through the tears. "We'll see what they wanted us to find," she whispered softly. But as she rose, a faint sound reached her ears, a sound that didn't belong to the desert, a low hum like a distant drumbeat echoing from the hills. It was faint but steady, and it made the hairs on her neck stand on end. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun, and listened. The sound grew louder, closer, rhythmic like heartbeats coming from the earth itself. She turned toward the hills, where the wind now moved strangely, bending the tall grass in circles. The air felt charged, as if holding the breath of something waiting, something ancient. She clutched the map tighter. Night would fall soon, and the desert could be cruel after dark. But she couldn't shake the pull in her chest, the feeling that something or someone was waiting for her there. She walked a few steps away from the cabin, then stopped to look back at it. The setting sun cast long shadows across its worn frame, making it look almost alive, watching her, guarding her. She smiled faintly. "I'll come back," she whispered. The wind answered with a soft sigh, lifting the edge of her dress. She placed a hand on her belly again, feeling the small movement beneath her skin. "We'll come back home," she said, her voice steady now. Then, with the last light of day fading behind her, she began walking toward the hills, the map in one hand and her other hand resting protectively over her unborn child. Behind her, the cabin creaked again, as if something inside had shifted. Through the broken window, a faint glimmer of light flickered, brief but real, like a candle being lit in the dark. And though she didn't see it, that old wooden box she had opened slowly began to hum, soft vibration that echoed the same rhythm she had heard from the hills. Whatever her parents had left behind wasn't just memory. It was alive, waiting to be found. The desert swallowed her footsteps as the first stars began to rise. And the story of her family, buried beneath years of dust and silence, was about to awaken once more. The night came quietly, wrapping the desert in a blanket of deep blue and silver. The stars stretched endlessly across the sky, bright and cold, while a faint wind moved through the sagebrush. She walked until the cabin was just a shadow behind her. The map in her hand trembled slightly in the night air, its markings glowing faintly under the moonlight. Every sound felt sharper, the crunch of sand under her feet, the distant cry of a coyote, the whisper of her dress brushing against her legs. She wasn't afraid. Something inside her told her that this night carried more than memories. She stopped by a group of stones, where her father once built a small fire during hunting trips. The ashes were long gone, but the circle remained untouched by time. She knelt beside it and placed her palm on the ground. It was warm, almost as if the earth still remembered him. Her father had been a man of strength and silence, one who believed that every stone and wind had a spirit. He used to tell her that their people were connected to the land through stories, that even after death, the land carried the voices of those who once lived upon it. She took a deep breath and looked toward the hills again. The drum-like sound had faded, but the feeling of being watched lingered. She had grown used to silence in her years alone, but this kind of silence was different, heavy, almost breathing. She placed the map beside her and looked at the stars, tracing the patterns her mother once taught her. That was how the old tribes traveled, by the stars and by faith. She whispered her mother's name softly and felt the wind shift. Brushing gently against her cheek, her mind wandered back to the day she left this land. She had been no older than 16 when soldiers rode through, ordering families to move or be burned out. Her father had argued, but there was no winning against rifles and fire. They left everything there: tools, their animals, even the small cradle her mother had carved by hand. That day, the smoke from their burning cabin filled the sky like a storm. She remembered looking back from the trail, watching the flames consume their home. She thought she would never see it again. Years later, when she returned to the nearest town after working for ranchers and traders, she learned that the cabin still stood half-burned, but not gone. The land had been sold off for almost nothing, left to rot in the desert. She sold what little she had and bought it back. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was hope. But something in her heart told her that her parents' spirits waited for her there now. Sitting under the vast sky, she wondered if that decision had awakened something more than memory. The box, the symbols, the faint hum, all of it felt connected, as if her parents had hidden something far deeper than she could yet understand. She looked down at her belly, feeling the small movements inside. "You'll know this land too," she said softly. "You'll walk it, feel it, love it." Her voice trembled as she spoke, filled with both promise and fear. She wanted her child to grow where roots ran deep, where stories still whispered through the wind. But she also knew the desert held more than love. It held secrets. The cold began to creep in, and she decided to rest near the old stone circle. She gathered some dry brush and lit a small fire, its glow dancing against her face. The crackle of wood was comforting. She warmed her hands and listened to the desert breathe. Somewhere out in the darkness, an owl hooted. Then, faintly, she heard something else, a voice. It was distant, broken by the wind, but clear enough to make her heart pound. It sounded like someone calling her name. She turned sharply, her eyes searching the dark. Nothing but the empty desert. She waited, holding her breath. The voice came again, softer this time, as if drifting through the earth itself. It was her mother's voice, gentle, familiar, calling her the same way she did when she was a child lost in the tall grass. She rose to her feet, her eyes wide. "Mother," she whispered, though the word caught in her throat. The wind stirred again, carrying the smell of rain, strange, since there hadn't been a storm in weeks. She looked toward the hills. For an instant, she thought she saw a faint light moving there, a flicker, like a lantern. Then it was gone. Sleep came slowly that night. She lay beside the fire, the map beside her, and drifted in and out of dreams. In one, she saw her parents standing near the cabin, holding hands. Her father looked older, tired, but smiling. Her mother reached out and placed her palm on her belly. Behind them, the same hills glowed faintly, with the same light she had seen before. Her mother whispered something, words she couldn't understand, before everything faded into darkness. When she woke, fire was only embers, and the sky had begun to pale with morning light. The map was still there, but now something new had appeared upon it. A new mark, a small circle, drawn near the edge of the hills. She hadn't drawn it, and it hadn't been there before. The charcoal looked fresh. Her heart beat fast as she traced it with her finger. She packed the map into her pouch and stood, brushing the sand from her dress. The air was cool and still. As she turned to leave, she saw something near one of the rocks, a feather dark brown with a white tip. It wasn't there the night before. She picked it up carefully and held it in her palm. Her father used to wear feathers like that during ceremonies. It was another sign, another piece of the mystery. By the time she returned to the cabin, the sun was climbing high. The wooden walls glowed golden under the morning light. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her mind heavy with questions. The box still sat where she left it, but now the faint humming sound was gone. In its place was silence, thick and deep. She sat by it again, staring at the carvings on its lid. Each line told a story of warriors, of storms, spirits watching over the living. She began to search through the cabin more carefully. Under a pile of old boards, she found a woven blanket, torn but still strong. Her mother had made it. She pressed it to her face, and tears filled her eyes. That blanket had once kept her warm during cold desert nights. Wrapped around her as her mother told her stories of how their people came from the stars. While she was lost in thought, something shifted under the floorboards. A dull creak. She froze, listening. It came again, a soft movement, like something stirring beneath her feet. She knelt and placed her ear to the floor. There it was, faint but real. A rustle, then silence. Her breath quickened. The cabin had no cellar, but maybe her parents had hidden something there long ago. She found a loose plank and pried it open carefully. The air that escaped was cool and dry. Beneath there was a narrow, hollow space. She reached down, and her fingers touched something wrapped in cloth. Pulling it up, she found another small bundle bound tightly with leather string. She untied it slowly, her hands shaking. Inside was a small carved stone with strange patterns etched across its surface. The carvings matched the symbols on the map. She turned it over, and on the back, she found something that made her heart stop, her family's tribal mark. Carved deep into the stone, and below it, the same handprint in dried earth as on the leather piece. Her mother's again. She sat there for a long time, staring at it, feeling the weight of generations pressing against her chest. Whatever her parents had hidden, it wasn't just for protection. It was meant for her. A legacy, maybe even a warning. The stone seemed to hum faintly in her hands, same way the box had before. Outside, the wind began to rise again, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. The door creaked open slightly, and the same strange feeling returned, as if someone stood just beyond the doorway, unseen. She rose slowly, clutching the stone to her chest, and looked out. The land stretched empty and silent. But she could feel it, the presence of something waiting. Her heart pounded as she whispered softly, "I know you're here." The wind shifted again, lifting her hair gently. The air around her shimmered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw movement near the edge of the desert, a tall figure standing still among the brush. Then it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She looked down at the stone in her hand, its carvings glowing faintly in the sunlight. The message was clear now. Whatever her parents had hidden, whatever secret lived beneath this land, it had found her, and as the desert wind carried the faint echo of that drum-like sound once more, she knew that her journey and her child's had only just begun. The sun had barely risen when the stillness of the desert was broken by the soft call of a distant crow. The Apache woman stood outside her cabin, staring toward the hills where the sound of the drums had once come from. The map weighed heavily in her pocket, and the carved stone she had found the day before rested close to her heart, tied to a string around her neck. Every time the wind passed, she could feel a faint vibration against her skin, like the heartbeat of something buried deep beneath the land. She had always believed the desert carried spirits, but now it felt as if those spirits were no longer content to remain silent. The air seemed alive with whispers, faint, almost words, blending with the sigh of the wind through dry brush. She turned toward the cabin and saw the shadow of the roof stretching long and thin across the sand, pointing directly toward the hills. That was where the answers waited. She knew she couldn't go alone. In the nearest settlement, 2 days' ride away, there was an old trader who sometimes dealt with the local tribes. He was one of the few white men who still treated them with a shred of respect. She decided she would go to him. If anyone knew the meaning of the carvings, it would be him. But leaving the cabin felt like abandoning something sacred, like stepping away from her parents' voices that seemed to whisper from the walls. As she packed a small bundle of food and water, she caught sight of her reflection in a cracked mirror. The years had etched quiet strength into her face, but the loneliness was there too. She brushed her long black hair behind her shoulders and pressed a hand to her belly. The child kicked softly, and she whispered, "I'll bring you home safe." The journey to town was long and hot. The desert stretched endlessly around her, shimmering under the weight of the sun. By midday, her feet ached, and her throat burned. She paused by a small stream that trickled between rocks, one of the few places where water still remembered its way. As she knelt to drink, she noticed strange marks along the bank, footprints, large and deep. They were fresh. Her heart tightened. Someone else had passed through this way, perhaps watching her all along. She stayed still, listening. The air was silent. Then a sound faint, like a soft rustle behind the bushes. Her hand went to the small knife at her waist. "Who's there?" She called out. No answer, only the whisper of the wind. After a long moment, She turned back toward the road. But her steps were quicker now, her eyes watching the horizon by evening. The town appeared a cluster of wooden buildings standing crooked under the orange glow of sunset. She walked past the saloon, past the general store, keeping her head down as curious eyes followed her. The people there were not kind to strangers, and even less to Apache blood. Some stared at her belly and murmured under their breath. She ignored them and went straight to the trader's small shack at the edge of town. The man was sitting outside, cleaning his rifle when he saw her. His name was Clay, a thin man with a white beard and eyes that seemed to see too much. "Well," he said slowly, setting the rifle aside, "I ain't seen you in a while. Thought you left for good." "I came back," she said quietly. "I bought my parents' land." He raised his eyebrows. "That old cabin? Ain't much left there but bones and dust. You sure you want that curse back?" Her voice hardened. "It's my family's place, and there's something there I need to understand." She took the stone from around her neck and handed it to him. "You ever seen markings like these?" Clay turned it over in his hands, studying it under the light. His expression changed from curiosity to unease. "Where'd you find this?" "In the cabin floor," she said. "It was hidden. My father carved these symbols." He rubbed his chin slowly. "I've seen something like this once, long ago. Not many know about it. Your people used to speak of stones that carried voices, old things buried before even the tribes came here. They said those who listened too long went mad." Her heart beat faster. "Voices?" He nodded. "A long time ago, before the soldiers took this land, a small band of your people vanished near those hills. They said they followed the sound of drums that came from underground. Only one man came back. He said the earth spoke to him that the land was angry for being disturbed." She swallowed hard. "Do you believe it?" Clay looked at her, his eyes sharp now. "I've lived here long enough to know that this desert remembers everything. Some things ain't meant to be found." He handed the stone back to her. "Whatever your folks were guarding, best leave it buried." She took the stone, wrapping it in cloth. "I can't. They left it for me. My mother's handprint is on it," he sighed. "Then you'll need help. Don't go near those hills alone." When she left, night had fallen again. The town lights flickered behind her as she walked back toward the desert. The air was cooler now, carrying the smell of sage and dust. But as she walked, the uneasy feeling returned, the same one she'd felt by the stream. She turned sharply. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows behind her, tall, still watching. Then it was gone. The wind rose suddenly, swirling sand around her feet. She clutched the stone tightly and whispered another prayer. By the time she reached her cabin, the moon was high, silvering the land. She opened the door and stopped. Something was wrong. The blanket she had folded neatly earlier was now on the floor, and the wooden box she had left closed was open again. Her breath caught. She stepped forward carefully, her eyes scanning every corner. Nothing moved, yet the air felt heavy, alive. She bent down to pick up the blanket and froze. Under it, in the dust, was a footprint. Bare, fresh. Fear gripped her. Someone had been inside while she was gone. She quickly checked the corners, the shadows, the floorboards, but there was no one there. Only that single footprint, clear as day. She sat down slowly, her heart pounding. Whoever it was had come and gone like the wind. The child stirred inside her again, a soft flutter that reminded her she couldn't afford to be afraid. She locked the door, lit a lamp, and sat beside the box. The stone pulsed faintly against her chest. When she opened the map once more, the new mark that had appeared before seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight. It was calling her again to the hills, to the source of everything her parents had kept hidden. But something else caught her eye this time. In the corner of the map, a faint line she hadn't noticed before appeared, written in her father's hand. It read, "The heart of the land beats where the drums begin." She ran her fingers over the words. The heart of the land. She thought of the stories her father used to tell about sacred places where the earth breathed and the ancestors listened. Maybe the stone wasn't a curse. Maybe it was a key. The following morning, she gathered her things. The fear from the night before still clung to her, but curiosity burned stronger. She would go to the hills. The child inside her kicked again, and she whispered softly, "You'll know why we came back." She hadn't walked far before she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned and saw a rider approaching, a man wrapped in a dusty coat, a wide hat shading his face. When he stopped beside her, she saw that he wasn't white, but part Apache like her. His eyes were dark and sharp, and his horse snorted softly as the man nodded. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "The land isn't safe these days." "I know the land," she replied calmly. He looked at her belly, then back at her face. "You're the one who bought the old cabin, yes?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "You should leave it. There are things buried there that don't rest easy. My grandfather told stories of your family and what they guarded. People disappeared searching for it." She stared at him, heart pounding. "What were they guarding?" He met her eyes. "Something the soldiers wanted. Something your father swore he'd never give up." The air between them grew still. "Do you know where it is?" she asked. He looked toward the hills. "Maybe, but finding it means waking things better left asleep." She looked in the same direction, the faint outline of the hills glowing under the morning sun. "Then maybe it's time to wake them," she said quietly. He said nothing. But his gaze lingered on her a moment longer before he turned his horse toward the trail ahead. "If you're going," he said, "you'll need someone who knows the old paths." She nodded, her fingers closing around the stone. Together, they started toward the hills, the sound of the wind following behind them like the faint echo of drums beginning again in the distance. The desert, vast and ancient, waited, and whatever secret lay beneath. Its sands was beginning to stir once more. The wind had turned sharp by the time they reached the edge of the hills. The Apache woman stood beside her guide, her hand resting on her belly as she looked at the land rising before them. The hills stretched like sleeping beasts, silent yet alive with the weight of old secrets. The air smelled different here, colder, heavier. The man beside her dismounted his horse and tied it to a mesquite tree. He turned toward her with quiet eyes that hid something deeper than words. "This is where the stories say it begins," he said softly. "The ground here remembers what men have forgotten." She looked at the map again, tracing her finger along the line her father had drawn. It led toward a narrow canyon that split the hills in two. The sun hung low, painting everything in a strange gold light that made the stones glow as if from within. Her heart beat hard. "Whatever they hid," she said, "they wanted me to find it." The man's voice was steady, but she could hear the unease behind it. "Then we'll go carefully. The land here can play tricks." They walked in silence for a long time. The canyon narrowed until the walls rose high on both sides, casting long shadows that swallowed the path. Each footstep echoed, and the air grew cooler with every step. She could feel the vibration of the stone against her chest. Faint, but steady, a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. Halfway through, the man stopped suddenly and crouched, touching the ground. "Tracks," he murmured. "Someone else has been here." She knelt beside him. The prints were faint, but fresh. Not animal, human. Her pulse quickened. "Do you think they're following us?" He stood slowly, scanning the ridge above. "Maybe they're ahead." The thought chilled her. Whoever had entered her cabin that night could have come this way too. She pressed the stone closer to her chest. "Then we can't turn back now," she said. "Not when we're this close." The path curved sharply, and the sound changed, the soft hum of the stone growing louder. They emerged into a small hollow where the canyon opened into a circle of rock. In the center, half buried under sand, stood something she hadn't expected, the remains of an old wooden structure, blackened by time. It looked like the entrance to a mine, its beams rotted but still holding. Her companion's jaw tightened. "That's not from your people," he said. "That's newer, built by settlers." She stepped closer, brushing away the sand near the entrance. Beneath the wood were carvings, her father's marks. The same patterns as on the stone, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and fear. "He hid something here." Before he could speak, the wind shifted. A faint sound came from inside, like a low chant carried from deep underground. They froze, listening. It wasn't the wind. It was too steady, too rhythmic. Her breath caught. "Do you hear that?" He nodded. "We're not alone." The sound grew clearer, not words, but voices, layered and distant. She stepped back instinctively, the hair on her arms rising. "What is it?" "Could be the echo of water," he said, though his tone was uncertain. "Or something else." The shadows inside the mine mouth seemed to move, breathing. She took a step forward, but he caught her arm. "Wait, let me go first." He drew his knife and moved slowly into the darkness, the beam of his lantern flickering against the walls. She waited outside, her hand on her belly, the stone now pulsing stronger than ever. Every second felt longer than the last. Then his voice came from inside, low but urgent. "Come here. You need to see this." She hesitated, then stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, thick with the scent of earth and age. The walls were covered in carvings, spirals, hands, faces, all etched into the stone. Some glowed faintly, as if lit from within. In the center of the chamber lay a circle of rocks, and at its heart a hole descending into the darkness below. From it came the hum, deep and alive, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. She stood frozen, unable to look away. The man glanced at her. "This isn't a mine," he said. "It's a burial ground." Her voice trembled. "For who?" "For those who came before even our ancestors," he whispered. "The old tribes said they were the first ones, the ones who walked with the wind." The hum deepened, the air around them trembling. The stone at her chest grew hot. She gasped and took a step back. The ground under her feet shifted slightly, as if something beneath the earth had moved. "We should go," he said sharply. "Now." But she shook her head, clutching the stone. "My parents died protecting this place. I have to understand why." He looked at her, torn between reason and fear. If this is what they guarded, maybe they meant to keep it closed. She looked down into the pit. The darkness seemed to pulse, each wave of sound sinking into her bones. Her mind filled with images, her mother's hand, her father's voice, the cabin burning, the sound of drums. It was all connected. Her parents hadn't been hiding treasure. They had been guarding something alive, something sacred, something the world had forgotten. Suddenly a shout echoed from outside. Both of them turned. A figure stood at the mouth of the canyon, holding a rifle. His clothes were torn, his face shadowed, but his stance was clear. He wasn't here to help. The man beside her cursed under his breath. "He followed us." The stranger stepped closer, the rifle steady in his hands. "Whatever's buried here," he said, his voice rough, "belongs to the government now. Move aside." The woman's heart raced. "You don't understand what this is," he sneered. "Don't need to. I just need what's inside that hole." The man stepped between them. "You don't know what you're touching," he warned. "Leave before the land takes you too." The stranger's eyes flashed with anger. "Step aside." Shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. The woman screamed as dust fell from the ceiling. The man beside her stumbled but stayed standing, his shoulder bleeding. The stranger stepped forward, kicking sand aside. "I warned you," he growled. The hum from the ground grew louder, deeper, shaking the walls. The stranger froze, looking down as the earth began to tremble beneath his boots. Cracks split through the floor, thin lines of light spilling out. The woman grabbed the wounded man and pulled him back toward the entrance. But the stone at her chest blazed with light, burning against her skin. The stranger backed away, his face pale. "What is this?" The air erupted with a low roar, like thunder buried beneath the earth. The carvings on the walls began to glow brighter, the faces almost moving. Wind swirled inside the cave, though there was no opening above. The woman clutched her belly, the child inside moving wildly as if it too felt the chaos. "Run!" the man shouted. They stumbled toward the exit, the ground shaking violently now. Behind them, the stranger screamed as the light engulfed him, pulling him toward the pit. His rifle clattered to the ground, and his voice was swallowed by the sound of the drums returning louder, older, like the heart of the land had awakened after centuries of silence. Outside, the sky had darkened. The wind tore through the canyon with wild force, carrying with it a strange song that sounded half like a chant, half like the crying of the earth. The woman fell to her knees, clutching the glowing stone. The man knelt beside her, his breath heavy, his wound dark with blood. "What is happening?" He shouted over the wind. She could barely speak. "It's alive. The land. It remembers." From deep within the canyon came another sound, a low rumble that rose higher and higher until it became a deafening roar. The earth split open behind them, sending a rush of blinding light into the sky. The air shimmered, filled with dust and fragments of stone. The woman shielded her eyes, her heart pounding. In that moment, through the chaos, she saw shapes in the light, shadows of people, old and strong, standing tall in silence. One of them stepped forward, and though she couldn't see its face, she felt the warmth of recognition. Her mother's voice whispered again, carried by the wind. "Remember." Tears filled her eyes. She turned to the man beside her. "We can't leave it. This is what they died for." He grabbed her arm. "If we stay, we'll die too." But she didn't move. The light pulsed again, wrapping around them both. The stone against her chest felt like it was part of her now, its rhythm matching her heartbeat and her child's. The canyon walls trembled, dust raining down. The wind howled like the voices of the past crying out for release. The ground beneath them cracked again, and through the blinding light came a sound, one final deep note that shook the sky. The woman stood firm, her hair whipping in the wind, her eyes filled with both fear and fire. The man reached for her hand, shouting her name. But the sound was lost in the storm. And then, as the light reached its peak, everything stopped, the wind, the sound, even the heartbeat of the land, as if the world itself was holding its breath for what would come next. When the roar faded, the world went quiet. Dust hung in the air, turning the light into gold mist. The Apache woman stood motionless, her hair tangled by the wind, her dress clinging to her skin. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it echo through her body, mixing with the faint beat of the stone that still glowed faintly at her chest. For a long moment, she didn't know if she was alive or dreaming. The canyon around them looked changed, as if the land itself had been reborn. The walls were cracked open, revealing layers of rock and roots that hadn't seen sunlight for centuries. The man beside her was breathing heavily, his wounded shoulder bleeding again. But he was alive. He touched her arm, his hand trembling. "It's over," he said softly, though his voice carried more disbelief than certainty. She looked toward the pit where the light had burst out moments before. It was sealed now, the ground smooth again, as if nothing had ever happened. Yet the air still shimmered with a strange energy. And the hum that had filled the earth was now deep inside her, echoing through her heartbeat. "No," she whispered. "It isn't over. It's only changed." They stayed there in silence, surrounded by the smell of dust and rain. The stranger who had followed them was gone, taken by the light. Only his rifle remained, half buried in the sand. The woman walked toward it and picked it up, her fingers brushing against the metal. It was cold, lifeless, a reminder of how greed and fear had tried to touch something sacred. She left it there and turned back toward the man. He looked at her with quiet respect. "Whatever that was, it wasn't meant for men like him," he said. "It wasn't meant for anyone to take," she replied. "It was meant to be protected." They made their way back toward the open desert, each step heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, streaking the sky with orange and pink. As they walked, the land around them seemed different, softer, alive again. Grass that had long been dry was pushing through the sand, and small flowers opened in their path. The desert had been quiet for too long, and now it was waking up. By the time they reached her cabin, the sky was burning with color. She helped him inside, cleaned his wound with water from her jar, and tore a strip from her dress to bind it. He winced, but didn't complain. When she finished, he looked at her and said, "You saved this place. Whatever was buried there, it's at peace now." She sat quietly by the window, her hands resting on her belly. "I didn't save it," she said. "It saved me." He didn't ask what she meant. He knew some things couldn't be explained with words. The air inside the cabin felt warmer now, like a home again. The boards that had once groaned with emptiness now seemed to breathe with new life. Outside, the wind brushed against the walls, not in warning this time, but like a soft song. That night, she dreamed of her parents again. They stood by the old fire pit, their faces gentle and proud. Her mother held the same stone that now hung around her neck and placed it into her hands once more. "You carried what we could not," her mother said, "and now the land remembers your name." When she woke, her cheeks were wet with tears, but her heart was calm. In the morning, the man prepared to leave. His wound was healing, and his eyes were clearer than before. "The hills will stay quiet now," he said as he saddled his horse. "What happened here won't happen again." She nodded, walking with him to the edge of the property. The wind carried the scent of wild sage, and the sound of the morning birds filled the air. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me when I didn't even understand what I was looking for." He gave a small smile. "You'll understand when the time comes. The land has its own way of teaching." He paused, glancing toward the horizon. "Take care of the child. The desert's spirit runs in that one too." After he rode away, the woman stood there for a long time, watching the dust rise behind his horse until he disappeared into the distance. The land stretched before her, endless and familiar, yet new again. She turned back toward the cabin, her parents' old home, now her own, and walked slowly inside. Days passed, and the air grew warm again. The cabin became a place of life. She repaired the roof, planted herbs near the steps, and hung her mother's blanket on the wall. Sometimes, when the nights grew still, she would hear faint drumming far away. Not frightening anymore, but steady, like the heartbeat of the earth keeping her company. The light that once burned through the canyon was gone. Yet its memory lived in everything around her, the wind, the soil, even the small flowers that grew near the cabin walls. When the time came, the child was born under the same roof where her mother once sang and her father once prayed. The air was filled with the scent of sage and smoke. The baby's first cry echoed across the desert, clear and strong. She held the child close, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're home," she whispered. "You belong to this land as much as it belongs to you." As the years passed, people from nearby towns began to notice how the land near her cabin had changed. The soil was rich, the plants green even in the dry season. Travelers would stop by asking her if she had some secret to make the desert bloom. She would only smile and say, "It's not a secret. It's a promise kept." She raised her child with stories of the old ways, stories of courage, of loss, of how the earth listens to those who walk it with respect. She taught them that the land isn't just something to live on, but something to live with. And when her child grew old enough to ask about the glowing stone that hung on the wall, she told them only that it carried the heartbeat of their ancestors, the same rhythm that lived in their own chest. Years later, when the hills turned golden under another setting sun, the child, now grown, stood outside the same cabin, just as their mother once had. The land was quiet, but it was no longer lonely. The wind carried laughter, the kind that once filled that home long ago. And though the world beyond the desert kept changing, the cabin remained, a small wooden heart standing strong against time inside. The woman sat by the window, watching the light fade across the sand. Her hair had turned silver, but her eyes still held the warmth of firelight. She reached out and touched the stone hanging nearby. It no longer glowed, but it still pulsed faintly, like a living thing. She smiled softly. "We remembered," she whispered. Outside, the stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was full. The wind brushed through the open doorway, carrying the same ancient hum, gentle now, peaceful. The land had been wounded once, but it had healed. And in its healing, it had healed her too, as she closed her eyes. The night settled around her like a blanket, and for the first time in many years, she felt no weight in her heart. The desert had given her everything it had taken her home, her family, her peace. By morning, the sun rose over the hills, golden and kind. The cabin stood quiet, the door open, the scent of sage drifting in the air. The child stepped outside, holding the old map in their hands. The path to the hills was still there, winding through the brush. They looked toward it for a long time. then turned back to the cabin with a calm smile. The land no longer asked for guardians. It simply asked to be remembered. And as the day grew brighter, the wind carried that promise once more. The story of a woman who returned home, faced the heart of the land, and left behind not fear or sorrow, but life.